Good evening, everyone. I would just like to echo Professor Sahami's sentiments about the Model United Nations Club. It really has changed the way I see the world, and if you are interested, feel free to ask any one of us or anyone you see in a suit tonight questions about the club. Okay. So first, I'm going to introduce the first topic, which is the United Nations relevant in our world today? Following the end of the Second World War, the most deadly event in history, which killed an estimate of 60 million people, world leaders vowed that they would do everything in their power to never let such an event of mass murder and destruction occur in the future. These leaders believed that there could be a better way to solve complex problems and issues rather than immediately resorting to war. So, on October 24th, 1945, in San Francisco, California, 51 countries, or member states as they are called by the UN, created and signed the United Nations Charter, which emphasized the need to prevent another world war. Today, 193 member states are now part of the United Nations, and each fall in New York City, a General Assembly of diplomats from each member state meets to discuss the problems of our time and attempts to offer solutions to these issues. While some argue that the United Nations has so far successfully accomplished their original goal of preventing another world war, others postulate the need for such an organization in our world today. During these speeches, I would remind the audience to ask themselves the following questions. Is the United Nations still relevant in our world today? Has the UN been a driving force for good, or has it failed to fully address the problems of our time? Is the UN a panacea for all the world's problems, or does the global community need to create new bodies and international organizations that discuss more specific global issues that the UN has so far failed to properly address? Does the UN take into account the needs and attempt to address the problems of developing member states, or does the UN only have an interest in the problems of the West and those member states that are more developed? The speakers before us today will address these questions and argue one way or the other whether the United Nations is still relevant today. The speaking order is as follows: Ryan Jordan from Team A, Randall Monson from Team B, then Lauren Yeoman from Team A, and finally Ashley Chan from Team B. We will entertain questions from the audience once all presenters have spoken. Thank you.
I'd like to start off with a quote from President Truman at the first opening ceremony of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Lately, we have all heard talk about the possibility of another world war. Fears have been aroused all over the world. These fears are unwarranted and unjustified. However, rumors of war still find willing listeners in certain places. If these rumors are not checked, they are sure to impede world recovery. I have been reading reports from many parts of the world. These reports all agree on one major point. The people of every nation are sick of war. They know its agony and its futility. No responsible government can ignore this universal feeling. This quote rings true today as it did 73 years ago. Just as the UN faced threats as soon as it was established, it still faces threats today. However, the threats of the 20th century differ from that of the 21st. But let us first go into some brief backstory about the UN and what its main objective is. As Isabel stated, the United Nations was established in 1945 after one of the deadliest wars in human history. It was designed to prevent another such conflict and create a prolonged peace. The UN is built upon maintaining peace and maintaining international peace and security, developing friendly relations among nations, promoting social progress, better living standards, and human rights. The United Nations does this by reducing the transaction cost of nation-states meeting with one another, instead of countries meeting one-on-one with each other, which is a slow and tedious process. They can all meet at one single place at any given time. Gone are the days of sending a message to the King of England and hoping to get a message back in time before the next war. But with all this time that the UN has been around, what has it accomplished? The UN organization that I'm sure most of you know is UNICEF, or the United Nations Children's Fund, which works in more than 150 countries. It is primarily focused on child protection, immunization, girls' education, and emergency aid. World poverty has been reduced from 50% in 1940 to just 9% as of 2016. The global infant mortality rate has been cut down from its high of 23% in 1940 to 5% in 2015. In 1946, the Commission on the Status of Women was created, which it is dedicated towards helping women around the world. In 1979, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which aims to make sure that everyone is treated equally across the globe. New cases of HIV have dropped by 45% of people above the age of 15 and dropped 71% of children below the age of 15 since 2000. The number of children ages 5 to 17 working has dropped by almost 100 million since 2000. 2 in 3 children worldwide participate in pre-primary or primary education in 2014. Would this progress have been made without the UN? Would we have made it this far without a major world war without the UN? The UN has been at the forefront of social progress, and without it, I doubt we would have come this far in the world. The UN set out Sustainable Development Goals to strive for what they have already come so far on. These goals were set out by the international community to achieve by 2030. The goals in the SDGs are some of the most ambitious goals ever set out by the international community. But the UN and the world as a whole have already made huge progress towards achieving them, especially with social issues. What the future holds for the UN. The future of the UN is based on the continued promotion of the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as promoting human rights as universal and not something only certain countries follow. The UN is at the core of the international world and has helped to usher in an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity for the world. The liberal world order has been followed since the end of World War II, and only recently has it come under fire. World leaders after World War II knew that the next war would truly be a war to end all wars, and one that would involve the total elimination of the human race. In an effort to slow this process down, and even prevent it, they came together in a hotel in San Francisco. But what are some of the challenges that the world now faces? Climate change, the refugee crisis, the economic crisis, nuclear instability, and human rights abuses. These challenges are not something one single country can solve. These challenges see no borders, they affect us all. However, we have a place for nations to combat these problems, a place where they can all come together and figure out a way to solve these issues, the UN. But there are agencies that slow down this process. Bureaucratic agencies would rather put their own self-interest first before the collective interest of the globe. The UN is in the linchpin in this effort. The international system is based upon the UN being at the center of it. It holds together other international organizations, and if you want to be a country, you must be a member of the UN. The main theory, also known as the liberal world order, is that if nation-states had a place to discuss their disagreements and come together on an international forum, the less likely would be for another world war, since they're able to talk about their disagreements instead of settling it on the battlefield. But the rise and continuing strength of authoritarian regimes the world over has been a visible trend for much of this decade. The liberal world order emphasizes the rule of law, international institutions, open and fair trade, and nations working together to deter aggression. The order is threatened by authoritarian and illiberal regimes, and the rise of populism and nationalism. What is particularly dangerous is that we not only have those threats from non-liberal states, but now we are seeing threats within liberal states. The end of the liberal world order is not inevitable, but it's unclear if that the ones who are instrumental in founding this order, notably the US, will have the political will and the capacity to prevent its demise. Thus, the future of the order is the most important strategic issue of our time, and reliant on the perspiration of international cooperation and organizations like the United Nations, which work to reinforce multilateralism, even in a challenging global context. The UN has also been the champion of globalization. If the world is more economically connected and nation-states' economies more intertwined with each other, they are less likely to go to war with each other. The world is more connected and we are more dependent upon each other. We are much less likely to want to go to war with each other because the cost of doing so is too high. Always smile more than you cry, give more than you take, love more than you hate. Thank you.
Recently in Syria, a devastating video of a chemical gas attack captures countless of civilians foaming out of their mouths and collapsing to their deaths. As the video goes viral, the United Nations goes AWOL. In response to the chemical gas attack in Syria, rather than the UN taking diplomatic actions, certain members of the United Nations Security Council ordered as many as 100 airstrikes, completely disregarding the innocent people in Syria. Originally formed in 1945 after World War II, the United Nations, an intergovernmental organization, is intended to address war crimes and prevent and achieve world peace. Perhaps the UN was efficient 73 years ago when the world was at war. However, seeing that there has yet to be peace amongst member states, should we even rely on the United Nations for global unity? Today, we see extreme situations of violence that the UN has failed to address. From the war in Syria to the genocide and sexual assaults in Rwanda, the UN continuously fails to protect and sustain world peace. The cost of the UN failing to address these issues can be portrayed by the death toll of 400,000 people in Syria and 800,000 in Rwanda. As the death rate continues to increase, the credibility of the UN decreases. With the failure to resolve international conflicts and the protection of human rights, the UN, along with member states, have been in direct violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as they continue to allow innocent lives to suffer. How many more people need to die in order to achieve world peace? Why do we need a UN when non-governmental organizations have the biggest impact when it comes to humanitarian aid? Along with the lack of response, the UN is flawed in areas of peacekeeping operations, especially amongst peacekeepers, who are military and police personnel, also known as blue helmet troops. These military and police personnel are given a mandate to protect and ensure the safety of civilians. However, they have this history of sexually assaulting young children and women. In July 2008, the Department of Field Support launched the Misconduct Tracking System, a global database for all allegations involving peacekeepers and sexual exploitations. Records shows between 2004 and 2016 that the UN received about 2,000 allegations of sexual exploitations against its peacekeepers. Yet it still doesn't compare to the vast amount of victims whose allegations weren't reported and possibly ignored. How can the very men who are trained to protect and ensure the safety of the individuals be the same men who restrain women and children from their human rights and well-beings, especially by means of underdeveloped states? How can this aggravation continue to happen when the UN and member states have pledged by the UN Standards of Conduct to ensure that all credible allegations are investigated and that appropriate actions are taken when allegations are confirmed? So why does this policy continue to lack action? Where is the consequence when the UN violate their own rules? It's not reasonable that individuals of a state bear the devastating results of the UN's failures. Furthermore, peacekeeping operations consist of men who lack knowledge and respect of gender equality. In addition, the UN and member states have yet to incorporate gender perspective views in areas that include peacekeeping operations, which as a result disregards the possibility of achieving the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal of gender equality that the UN presumably works to accomplish. The ends do not always justify the means. The UN, without question, has failed to protect the rights of citizens, ethnic minorities, women, and children. The UN has ignored and stood by during episodes of genocide, especially in developing countries, states. Whether committed in a time of peace or in a time of war, genocide is a crime under the international law convened by the civilized world. Indeed, in a developing state, the UN peacekeepers have inflicted more damage than peace. For instance, in Rwanda 1994, as peacekeepers stood by, approximately 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were slaughtered by military troops. Over 100 days in an organized program of genocide. Throughout the massacre, both the UN and the US carefully reframed the labeling the killing as genocide, which had defied an emergency intervention. To make things even worse, in 1999, an inquiry found that the UN in New York had ignored evidence that the genocide was being planned. As a result of their ignorance, the genocide in Rwanda went down in history as the quickest killing spree in the world. The genocide is now over, but the history still remains, illustrating the pain and the suffering of the innocent. Now, who is at fault here for such incidents to occur? Is it the US or was it the UN? Regardless of who holds power, both the UN and member states must be held accountable when international crimes are committed. Today, too often when member states address an issue or binding resolution, the UN, specifically Security Council, may deny any type of assistance, illustrating the powerlessness and misrepresentation of member states. Without a shred of doubt, there is a lack of representation in the Security Council, as only 5 permanent members hold true power, while other member states are merely bystanders. So what does the UN Security Council really fear for them not to have equal representation within the United Nations? From the beginning of the bloody conflict in Syria of October 2011 to April 2017 and continuing, measures addressed by 65 member states, such as Egypt, New Zealand, and Spain, have all called for a resolution to end all attacks in Syria, except both China and Russia have used their veto powers multiple times to block such resolutions. Truly, this is a tragic moment in time for the civilians in Syria, as they continue to witness the death toll of their own people increase. The Security Council continues to fail on rigorous actions. Although 5 billion members of the Security Council may have the power to veto resolutions, they cannot suppress the human rights and the desire for justice of the Syrian people. The deliberate actions of the Security Council has stopped the UN from addressing 21st century viewed global issues and have contributed to nearly 73 years of unsolved disputes. The UN must stop pretending that the protection of civilians is beyond their power, as they continue to look for the right way to do the wrong things. In addition, the United States refused to join the United Nations in 1945 unless it was given veto powers. Same goes for Russia. This illustrates how every nation wants to be recognized as a top dog. But in the end, we will only remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. If the purpose of the United Nations is to protect the peace and prevent war crimes, why deny measures that give the state an opportunity to progress and protect the peace? Was the UN really formed as an intergovernmental organization to bring about world peace? Or was it an invitation to an elite world assembly, hungry for power, hungry for a new world order? Throughout the evidence of consistent failures for global peace, for global prosperity, must this be the reality of the innocent people who continue to suffer? Should the people of the world continue to rely on the United Nations? Thank you.
Now, with all institutions, there are flaws. There's no denying that. But it is important to look at the United Nations through the lens of a cost-benefit analysis. Let's start out with the cost that the critics love to extrapolate on. There's an unequal amount of power between the permanent 5 members due to veto powers, especially for an organization so focused on equality. The UN has not succeeded in staunching persistent conflict throughout the Middle East, the continued prevalence of genocide, and do we even need the United Nations now that we have regional organizations and non-governmental organizations? Addressing the unequal distribution of power, the United Nations is based on the collective security of all member states, which is being jeopardized by the superpowers by putting their agendas ahead of the collective good of the United Nations. But the organization itself should not be put at fault due to individual state selfishness. In terms of regional conflict, such as Somalia and Afghanistan, it is true that wars have seemed to go on forever recently, but it's due to the shift in wars that have occurred. War is not happening between states, but rather within states, by non-state actors. The United Nations has had to adapt to this new form of war since it was created to mediate conversation between member states rather than these new forces. Traditional diplomacy alone cannot end the type of conflict that has persisted, but the United Nations has adapted by isolating conflict through targeting actions such as arms embargo. Such is the case with genocide. It is important to remember that the United Nations is not the world police, but rather an open forum for discussion for all member states who have to keep in mind of each other's sovereignty. And unfortunately, most of the time, genocide is only discovered and is able to be defined as genocide after it has already started. Now there's the question of, is the United Nations relevant nowadays, since we have regional organizations and non-governmental organizations? While these organizations are tailored specifically to their needs, ultimately they are only for regional issues, not global. The United Nations takes the work of regional organizations and then applies it to a global scale. In terms of non-governmental organizations, there's no question of whether or not they are needed or effective, because they are. But solely replacing them for the United Nations, as my opponent might suggest, is not the answer. The United Nations has seen great success in working hand in hand with these organizations by creating public-private partnerships, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Bill Gates himself was given the opportunity to speak in front of the United Nations General Assembly in 2008 about his hopes for the Millennium Development Goals and the future for the United Nations and his partnership with his foundation. The United Nations was able to give an important cause a large platform of leaders from around the world as an open forum for discussion, as it was intended for. Not to mention, many non-governmental organizations are supported by the United Nations Trust Fund, such as Amnesty International, Acid Survivors Trust International, and the Worldwide Organizations for Women, just to name a few. So we may ask ourselves, why do we even need an open forum? Why not member states meet with each other on their own time? It makes sense to ask this question. Leaders are adults, and they should be able to work out their schedules and figure out who they want to meet with, when they want to meet with. But would the larger countries even bother listening to the smaller countries? Or even bother hearing about what countries around the world feel on the exact same issues they're combating? If we would fight less and talk more, the United Nations General Assembly provides an equal platform for all member states to be heard and collaborate with each other. This also brings me to the point of global issues. The world needs a place where everyone needs to be on the same page on transnational issues. Climate change, pandemic, Ebola for example. It showed intense transmission in Guinea, Syria, and Liberia. It has been 15,351 reported Ebola cases in 8 countries since the outbreak began. Cybersecurity. In 2013, there have been 3,809,448 records stolen for breaches every day. Transnational crimes, including the trafficking of drugs, small arms and light weapons, and humans. Terrorism. Globally, we've seen that terrorism has no borders. 9/11, the attacks in Paris claimed by the Islamic State, the Brussels attacks, and the recent bombings in in Afghanistan. How are we supposed to effectively take on these issues alone when they affect everyone? Since we're looking at this from a cost-benefit analysis, let's look at the benefits. The United Nations has seen great social progress around the world. Through Sustainable Development Goal 1, otherwise known as no poverty, there has been a significant drop in the amount of people living on less than $1.90 a day. It has dropped from a high of 1.7 billion to 766 million. That's a 55% decrease of the amount of people living in extreme poverty. To re-emphasize the previous point of my partner of having international standards for human rights, without the United Nations, the world would have no baseline for what is and what is not considered a human right. Looking back at what Bill Gates spoke at the United Nations General Assembly, he reminded us, we have to acknowledge the progress in some areas is disappointing. But disappointing should not mean discouraging. This is the first time we have the whole world focused on these problems, and so it's not surprising we do not get perfect grades. So, it all boils down to this. Do we need the United Nations? The answer is yes. Of course, the United Nations has its flaws, again, as all organizations do. There's no denying that. But do the benefits outweigh the costs? Absolutely. It is because of the United Nations that there's been the creation of the Declaration of Human Rights, Millennium Development Goals, and Sustainable Development Goals. And now there is a standard for the way humans should be treated. And of course, there are still crimes against humanity happening. But now we can at least recognize these are crimes due to this new global standard that the United Nations has established. It is because of the very existence of the United Nations that all 193 member states come together in a neutral, productive, and sacred environment to discuss and focus on the most prevailing issues of our time. Thank you.
And finally, for the first topic, may I present Ashley Tran.
It's obvious that my opponents here are very well versed in the matter at hand. However, with their knowledge, they still fail to acknowledge key aspects of this argument. A report done by the United Nations High-Level Independent Panel of Peace Operations states, and I quote, "Recommendations and resolutions have largely gone unimplemented. The United Nations themselves knows that what they're doing isn't working, and it's time for us to identify and address these grave failures." The main claim here is that the so-called success of the UN has been opening up a forum for countries to communicate in a way that perpetuates peace. Putting aside the UN's dismal track record at peacekeeping missions and their failures to assuage conflict and war, there are already ways countries are doing this. This is already happening thanks to trade agreements, political alliances, and the digital age. Leaders and diplomats use telephone diplomacy, trade pact meetings, and other various partnerships in order to communicate without the use of the UN. I mean, the United Nations couldn't even bring Nixon into China in the 1970s, but ping pong diplomacy did. To reiterate, a ping pong tournament brought the president into China when the United Nations couldn't. This is a lot about how useful the UN is. If we take a look at NGOs, they are more effective in the aftermath of immediate crises. For example, ASTI has successfully provided medical and psychosocial support to over hundreds of chemical attack victims in multiple countries. Now, when you look at the UN's counterpart, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, they've done little to nothing to address the actual needs of chemical victims. In fact, they have recently sent in investigators to search for chemical weapons in Syria and have found nothing. We obviously know this is not correct. Other NGOs, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, have had momentous progress in improving health conditions around the world and have even eradicated polio, while the World Health Organization has had a multitude of failures in regards to responding to health crises, such as the Ebola crisis in 2015. Additionally, institutions separate from the UN are more successful at cooperating together, such as Interpol and NATO. In fact, NATO was able to bring post-communist states into the alliance to forge better international relations, more so than the UN has ever done. Obviously, states are successful at working together without the UN, working more successfully, actually. One could even argue that the proceedings of the UN models out the voice of the little man, in favor of giving the mic to larger countries who would support more in terms of funds. Despite countries evolving into economic dominant states, some still don't have a permanent place on the Security Council. My opponent here says that the UN is based on putting the collective good before the individual, and that the organization itself should not be put at fault due to state selfishness. However, I disagree. States will always put their own agendas first, no matter how badly we would like to think otherwise. This is the most rational way to approach these global politics, and we cannot think idealistically here. The current 5 members were unable to stop the conflict in Darfur or the Rwandan genocide. To make matters worse, 4 out of the 5 members are part of the global north, leading to a direct lack of representation in the global south. With the global south contributing to a large majority of this conflict, it seems irrational and incredibly inefficient that there's little to no representation. In the UN, everybody talks and everybody listens, but solutions are always missing. If we're being honest here, the facts speak for themselves, yet the other side fails to acknowledge them. We can argue that they even attempt to ignore these facts in order to advocate for their faulty, idealistic ways, rather than addressing them head-on. After the fall of the Soviet Union, more states looked to the UN than ever. However, they were let down again and again. The UN's record in preventing armed conflict is inefficient. The United Nations was unable to prevent the Vietnam War or the Korean War, nor were they able to prevent or even handle the immense conflict still occurring in the Middle East. The UN's model centers around fostering peace and preventing conflict. However, if we just take a quick glance at the past events in the past few years, we can conclude that peace is still nowhere to be found. Idealism is not the way to go here. Idealism, in the scope of viewing the UN, is delaying development and even hindering the solution of problematic international issues. The UN's numerous failures deem the institution inefficient. Its goals are realistic, but it's obvious that the UN achieving them is not.
At the end of World War II. If a nuclear weapon was dropped on a major city in the US or Asia, potentially tens of millions could perish. Obviously, this catastrophic event must be avoided at all costs. But with a potentially nuclear-armed North Korea, who has in the past directly and indirectly threatened such a case, we must first establish what the best way to avoid this scenario will be. But what are the possible options in our diplomatic toolbox to properly address rogue states that possess or are developing weapons of mass destruction, such as North Korea, Iran, and Syria? Terms that will be used in this speech include hard and soft power and nuclear non-proliferation. Hard power is defined as a show of direct, usually military force, while soft power is economic, political, or cultural influence, coercion, or sanctions. Nuclear non-proliferation is defined as the goal of reducing the amount of prevalence of nuclear weapons across the globe. Diplomacy has in the past been used as a powerful tool to overcome complex global issues. But for diplomacy to truly be effective, do we not need trust between world leaders? And unfortunately, trust can be lost within seconds, it takes a lifetime to regain, and is still never as strong. The 2 teams presenting today will be debating what the best course of action for the United States to pursue nuclear deterrence is. Is it a show of force and power, or is the solution a diplomatic one? The speaking order for the second topic will be as follows. Zach Durkee of Team B, George Diamantopoulos from Team A, Dylan Cowell from Team A, and finally, Nader Merdadi. After which time we will entertain questions from the audience for both topic 1 and topic 2. Thank you. First up, we have Zach Durkee.
America did not become a world power through the art of dealing with people and states in a sensitive way, this tactic being the very essence of diplomacy. America is what it is because of how we exemplify power being through our economic influence as well as militarily. Power is, and always has been, how A can make B something B wouldn't otherwise do. Utilizing America's power has become more vital than ever in a world where weapons that have the power to wipe humanity off the face of the earth seem to be getting into the hands of non-compliant, unstable actors more and more often. Actors who do not stick to the rules and norms the rest of the world adheres to, and actors who can be viewed as irrational and unpredictable. Rogue nuclear states not only pose a threat to us, but to the world itself. Rogue states ignore international laws, rules, and norms, and only listen when faced with real threats. Specifically, if the leader feels their power, life, or regime is being threatened. These kind of actions is what separates the US from these actors. The US has spearheaded numerous treaties such as SALT and the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which have improved international security. A nuclear rogue state is seen to meet certain criteria, such as being ruled by authoritarian governments that severely restrict human rights, sponsoring terrorism, and seeking to proliferate weapons of mass destruction. North Korea and Iran are both defined as nuclear rogue states for their lack of commitment to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and both exemplify why diplomacy has not and will not work unless power coerces them into being diplomatic. Diplomacy is useless without power, and quite frankly, talk is cheap. The reality is this tough question of what works best, power or diplomacy, will determine how we confront the storm ahead and how America itself addresses regimes who use a weapon capable of displaying the worst aspects of humanity as a bargaining tool to consolidate power and a commodity in which they can sell to further develop their own programs. Actors like North Korea, who have zero regard for human life, as exemplified with their long list of human rights abuses, have no place of having possession of civilization-ending weaponry. Both North Korea and Iran serve as examples of diplomacy's failure to deal with rogue nuclear actors. When we look at the case of Iran and the United States' use of diplomatic means, we see a situation that resulted in a deal that only temporarily stunts Iran's nuclear ambition and allows Iran to grow their economy to the point where in less than a decade it will have the capability to swiftly develop an arsenal. Iran sees nuclear proliferation as a token to becoming an undisputed regional hegemon in the Middle East, thus igniting an arms race that will only destabilize and thrust the Middle East into a race to the bottom. In terms of North Korea, it's a pipe dream to assume Kim Jong-un has any interest in actually dismantling his nuclear program, which he views as his regime's only source of legitimacy. Vladimir Putin even went as far to say that North Koreans would rather eat grass than give up their nuclear arsenal. In terms of failure of diplomacy, it can be summed up as promises made and continuously broken, spanning across more than 3 decades and 3 generations of the Kim dynasty. Attempting diplomacy without coercion at this point is like trying to patch the holes in the already sunken Titanic. As you can see with this timeline, it shows key events in terms of diplomatically trying to deal with the Kim regime, all of which have gone nowhere. We see a total of 5 times that we've tried diplomacy with them, and they have gone nowhere, or 4. 5 is coming up. North Korea has a track record of presenting to the world that they are indeed willing to cooperate, but simply and always have slipped back into threatening the United States and its allies with nuclear weapons. My opponent will paint me as a warmonger, hungry for the use of force, but in a world of competing interests, you cannot be so idealistic and naive to assume playing nice with a tough guy is going to achieve anything. Play nice with a nice guy and play tough with a tough guy. It's that simple. The use of power has a broad spectrum of application, these being through economic sanctions or show of military force. If North Korea were diplomatic, would it throw its own people in prison camps to starve? It would not allow for rape to run rampant within these camps, and it would not subject its own people to some of the worst conditions known to man in order to continue to proliferate weapons of mass destruction. Kim Jong-un is not beholden to his people. He uses his people to benefit himself and his own ambitions, And the only way to make it clear that we as a nation will not tolerate it is with the threat, show, or use of force. What diplomacy has achieved with North Korea and Iran is appeasement. Your group will paint the use of power as an inevitable catastrophic war, but what I challenge you to explain is what diplomacy has achieved up until this point. You can also explain to me why you think Kim Jong-un is just now ready to talk denuclearization. Is it out of goodwill? Is it because he's concerned for the very people he lets starve and die in the streets, or the women who get raped in these camps, or the innocent people being stoned to death for petty crimes? Or is it because Trump's use of strategic multilateral sanctions, strong words, and show of military strength has threatened his own little power bubble that he grasps to with an iron fist? The use of power is not synonymous with war. As President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man who believed in diplomacy and trade being a key to world peace, once said, "The only thing to fear is fear itself." And if we as a country let the fear of war guide our policy and actions, then we let cowards, animals, and murderers like Kim Jong-un succeed in their goal to disrupt the very trade and stability this group sees as the golden ticket to cooperation and peace. Attempting diplomacy with these actors in the past 33 years has only threatened and destabilized the very neoliberal ideals your group believes is key to world peace and cooperation. These recent talks have been conducted before, so don't let them fool you. Kim Jong-un is blind to reason, and given the opportunity to be diplomatic, rogue states like North Korea have chosen to participate in the proliferation of WMDs. So unfortunately, we must now move beyond reason and must respond with power. The time for optimism is over, and if these upcoming talks are to produce any real progress on de-escalation, North Korea must be held accountable to whatever possible deal may be brokered with the threat of force if they break the now fifth commitment they've made to denuclearization. We cannot be afraid to confront the inhuman and evil itself. And let me make this clear. I'm not here to tarnish what diplomacy stands for. I'm here to say diplomacy cannot be achieved without power to coerce unconventional actors like North Korea. Thank you.
Next up, we have George Simon-Topolis.
The carrot and the stick. In international relations, they represent diplomacy and violence. They are the two options that countries have when dealing with one another. However, despite the massive success it has had in stopping another world war from breaking out in the last 7 decades, and deterring many threats of nuclear war, diplomacy has often been undervalued in the role that it plays in keeping the peace. Diplomacy, put simply, is the coming together of two or more actors to establish some sort of dialogue. It is when representatives from a country go to see each other to discuss issues that they have and ultimately reach a compromise. Diplomacy can ensure that actors that are violent or powerful or aggressive can't throw their weight around and try to increase hostilities between other nations. Diplomacy can ensure other countries that they will not be forced to make a change without first having their voice heard by the international community. After the Second World War, diplomacy through trade has been very important in preventing another war from breaking out, because countries that trade together don't go to war with one another. For example, when the United States imports lots of cheap goods from China to maintain a very high standard of living, with Nikes, iPhones, and handbags, and China relies on markets in the United States to sell these goods to them and keep its workers employed, neither country is going to be willing to go to war with one another, because they need each other to survive. This way, through trade, a tool of diplomacy, countries are able to work together to form a compromise for their interdependent economies, rather than being at their throats, calculating the body counts for a war. In this day and age especially, with rogue states like Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and Syria constantly becoming aggressive and blatantly disregarding human rights, with Syria using chemical weapons, China using tanks to run over peaceful protesters, Iran imprisoning political dissidents, and North Korea constantly threatening their neighbors with nuclear weapons. Now, diplomacy is important, now more than ever. These rogue states in particular are nations that use these tools that they have to blatantly disregard human rights constantly break international law and pose a threat to their neighbors. While our first inclination might be to try and deal with these kinds of actors militarily, it is also important to recognize the massive cost that is associated with taking such an action. It is because rogue states like these have very powerful militaries that the cost of going to war in cases like this has body counts reaching into the hundreds of thousands, with the number of innocent civilians being injured, killed, or displaced in the millions. But before even considering these costs, it is particularly important right now that we recognize the people that we are asking to make these decisions and how they truly feel about these wars. If we just look to the president, the commander-in-chief, Donald Trump, a man who was able to dodge the draft for Vietnam by getting his doctor to exempt him for saying that he had bone spurs. A man who called John McCain, a man who was captured in war, a loser. A man who said that in the 1970s, him avoiding STDs was his own personal Vietnam. Or if we look to John Bolton, an incredibly hawkish man who never found an intervention or a bombing he didn't like. A man who was able to dodge the draft for Vietnam by saying that he had no desire to die in some Southeast Asian rice paddy in a war that he believed was already lost. Bolton is currently a national security advisor to Trump, and he currently advocates a first strike policy of going to war with both Iran and North Korea. However, it should be fairly apparent to you that these warmongers, these chicken hawks, these people who shoot first and ask questions later, have two very different sets of standards for their willingness to go to war. A very reluctant one when they are asked to do it themselves, and a much, much more enthusiastic one when they can go send someone else's children to go do it for them. Now back to the costs. If we just look to the toll of the Iraq War to take out Saddam Hussein, who was the leader of a relatively small rogue state, we recognize that approximately 50,000 combatants lost their lives, not to mention the 123,000 innocent civilians who lost their lives that wanted no part of this war and just happened to be in the way. This doesn't include the over 3 million civilians that were displaced with no home to go back to. It is because the cost of war is so high and takes such a toll on human life that we must first recognize the massive issues that occur when we fail to look to the consequences of our actions and ensure that we should not go to war unless all possible options have been exhausted, until we have done everything possible to know that this was necessary. Otherwise, it will merely be another moral choice in which the blood of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians will be on our hands. Consequences like these are why diplomacy is so necessary. Diplomacy can put many, many more options on the table. Aid, sanctions, trade, peace talks. These are the tools of diplomacy that keep the world from constantly falling into chaos. The Iran deal reached in 2015 by the Islamic Republic of Iran, the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, France, Russia, and China, as well as the European Union, is a shining example of the triumph of this diplomacy in action. Sanctions were able to effectively target Iran's oil and petroleum industries in order to bring Iran to the table to reach a deal on its nuclear program. Then, after Iran was able to convert its nuclear facilities and to ensure that they would no longer be able to create a weapon, and also allow for independent inspections in accordance with the deal, the world was able to breathe freely without the threat of another nuclear power in the Middle East, and Iran was able to continue with its economy unconstrained by Western powers. In spite of the progress that has been made with the Iran deal, it was called into question recently when Donald Trump said that he wanted the United States to pull out of the deal. However, when the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, came to the United States to deliver a speech to Congress, he reminded the nation that closing the door to the world will not stop its evolution, and that as the United States invented this form of multilateralism, it should be the one to keep it. If we do not, we risk the rest of these worlds merely moving on without us. Because it isn't about who did it first, it's about who did it best. Now, in the legacy of that multilateralism, we only look to North Korea, a country that no one thought would change without an intervention or the country being first reduced to rubble. We can look to, because of diplomacy, the way that we saw North Korea, South Korea, China, and the United States coming together to form an agreement that we were able to have Kim Jong-un walking over to the DMZ and actually shaking hands with Moon Jae-in. An agreement that no one thought was possible. This is what diplomacy can achieve. And when the cost of human life is so high, when we can be able to actually bring each other up together through trade, and when we know the leaders that are cheering on these wars are cowards themselves, when we know deep down a deal can disrupt or a compromise can be made with dozens of countries working together, when we are dealing with unstable actors with stakes that are higher than we can count, it is time that we choose diplomacy first and leave war as a last resort.
A problem has arisen with the tactics used for denuclearization, the use of diplomacy for the quelling of weapons of mass destruction owned by rogue states. Albeit diplomacy is the option desired by most people, it is also infeasible when dealing with rogue states who themselves are irrational. Those who believe that rogue states can be rationed with when they opt out of international relationships look at this issue from the outdated lens of the Cold War, which the United States and the Soviet Union reluctantly agreed to decrease the number of nuclear weapons that both sides had. Though this may appear like the product of diplomacy, a more realistic motivation behind this move is revealed: the fear of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. As such, both sides came to the table because both sides understood the danger and the deadly cost that nuclear weapons held. While the opposition might argue that the nuclear deal with Iran and the negotiations with North Korea are signs that diplomacy is in fact working, I would like to argue that the threats of force and economic sanctions issued by the United States are what drove North Korea and Iran to begin bending to our will in the first place. Kim Jong-un himself even recently offered denuclearization in exchange for a U.S. pledge to not invade, which shows how power was the motivation for compliance. Likewise, though Iran accepted its nuclear deal, which permits foreign inspectors to ensure that Iran is not producing nuclear weapons, we see this deal as temporary and as a single bandage on the gaping wound. Once this deal's time frame has been met, Iran will become free to continue development on these weapons with hopes of becoming a regional hegemon if they haven't already in secret. Adding to this, Iran only accepted this deal because the United States displayed its power through sanctions, which strangled the Iranian economy so efficiently that it caused them to bend to the will of President Obama. And, to be clear, Obama's will was the nuclear deal, otherwise he would not have approved of it. Furthermore, sanctions are indeed the use of power because it is a tactic used in order to strangle a country's economy in order to conform to another's will. It is thus an economic attack rather than a physical one. Do not mistake sanctions for coercive diplomatic strategy, for the effective populace, innocents included, feels repercussions in loss of wealth and assets. Diplomacy, on the other hand, should, in theory, harm neither side, whereas sanctions do. America's strength does not solely arise from its military. Rather, I would argue that the reason the United States has such a highly developed military is a result of our massively powerful economy. Thus, due to the United States' vast economic strength, the United States can afford to issue such sanctions and use these economic attacks to choke misbehaving rogue states without causing any harm to the American populace. With regards to WMDs, however, President Assad in Syria has been reported to have used chemical weapons upon his civil war-engulfed populace. The issue with the use of chemical weapons is, however, is that it violates the Geneva Convention and is classified as a weapon of mass destruction. Additionally, because Syria does not conform with the international norms, it could also be said that Syria too has become a rogue state. As a result of the recent April military strikes conducted by the US and its allies upon Syria, the US has already sent and acted upon its warning for rogue nations to never cross our set red line of using chemical weapons. The precedent of a heavy price having to be paid for the use of chemical weapons and other WMDs has been established. Should one use these weapons of mass destruction, the United States will respond by destroying one's assets and even their lives. The use of a big stick to back one's soft-spoken words via the projection of power can indeed be a feasible tactic to ensure that weapons of mass destruction are not misused, as it adds a disastrous cost to using them in the first place. To those who say that one can never be certain whether a state misuses their weapons of mass destruction technology, a quote from the former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, rings true. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, or vice versa. As such, brushing the issue of denuclearization under the bed on the basis that there is no evidence of rogue states owning or misusing WMDs should not be recognized as an argument, because it undermines the basic principles of eliminating these weapons and reinforcing their accountability in the first place. It is better to be stalwart and vigilant than naive and morally irresponsible. The solution is simple. If rogue states do not care for international norms nor request for diplomacy from the international community, then only one viable method remains: the use of one's power or the threat thereof. By undertaking this tactic, rogue states may figuratively bend the knee as the base interest of all countries, whether they're accountable or not, is to defend their population and maintain their monopoly of power. Should either be threatened with some form of complete annihilation or otherwise, then it stands to reason that these rogue states would opt to seek out the root of peace and bend to the will of responsible nations when they otherwise wouldn't, for the cost of misbehaving would skyrocket to the point where they could not maintain the desired rogue way of life. The use of power is necessary in any case, because even if one decided to use the end route of diplomacy for denuclearization, power would still be required to enforce peace, stability, and accountability within these rogue states. Otherwise, if power was omitted, nothing would prevent rogue states from continuing to violate international norms and laws. Therefore, the best method to reduce the use and development of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction is through the threat or use of one's power. Thank you.
And our final speaker tonight is going to be Nader American.
America did, in fact, become a world power through diplomacy, contrary to what the previous speakers would have led you to believe. And they are correct in that power is the ability of one actor A to get another actor B to do something that that actor B would not have initially done otherwise. And that power is called diplomacy. And as you will come to understand from these final remarks, you will know that first strike should never be first choice. And as my partner, Mr. Diamantopoulos, stated earlier, diplomacy in its simplest, most rudimentary form is the coming together of two or more actors to establish some form of dialogue between the two. And to neglect this and choose a path of heavy-handedness in terms of dealing with rogue actors like North Korea, Iran, and Syria is to neglect the mistakes from our past, the lives of our people, and the standards we hold dear to ourselves in the name of democracy. So let this be clear. We advocate for a solution towards peace without the discharge of weaponry, not the total neglect of our military, not the dismantlement of our military. To be pro-power over pro-diplomacy is to be in favor of exclusively using military options over negotiating, despite what they might have led you to believe. To be in favor of diplomacy over power is to be in favor of exhausting all alternative possibilities before entertaining military alternatives. It is because of diplomacy alone, not military might, that North Korea has come to the negotiating table. And when we compare the situation between Syria and North Korea, we must come to learn that we mustn't let Twitter fingers turn to trigger fingers. Looking to North Korea, Kim Jong-un recently made his first foreign trip since coming into power in 2011. He met with President Xi Jinping of China on March 25th in Beijing to discuss dismantling North Korea's nuclear program. This visit represented a colossal shift for North Korea. It also represented a massive domino effect, leading to Kim Jong-un meeting with CIA Director Mike Pompeo in early April. And then, this last Friday, April 27, 9 a.m. Korean Standard Time, Kim Jong-un crossed the demilitarized zone into North Korea to pledge peace on the Korean Peninsula and formally bring an end to the Korean War. And as you can see, their meeting was very fruitful. We even have President Trump right now pledging to meet with Kim Jong-un in the upcoming weeks to discuss this upcoming situation. So, why did this work? Why haven't the years of the war game exercise make North Korea fold earlier? The answers lie in Kim Jong-un's speech to the Chinese People's National Congress. He then knew only such measures would lead us to where we are today. And he stated, in this spring full of happiness and hopes, I believe my first meeting with General Secretary Xi Jinping will yield abundant fruits of Democratic People's Republic of Korea and China friendship and facilitate peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. The issue of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula can be resolved if South Korea and the United States come together with a resolve and create an atmosphere of peace and stability while taking progressive and synchronous measures for the realization of peace. Synchronous measures for the realization of peace. It is only because of such measures that North Korea has began opening up. It is because of such measures that the situation on the Korean Peninsula has come to a resolve. Now let us address the attention raised to the Iran nuclear deal. Dylan claims it was disastrous for the United States. Their main argument is that the deal's main provisions are set to expire within 10 years. However, the deal really did dismantle all of Iran's possibilities towards achieving a nuclear weapon in the interim. Not even the deal's critics contest this point any longer. And instead, they call attention to the billions of dollars that Iran received in return for the deal, ignoring that these funds were the return of assets that were frozen in response to Iran's ambitions. That's how sanctions work. That's how diplomacy works. And it's how the Iran nuclear deal is done. Just this past Monday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made a presentation alluding to Iran's plans to build a nuclear weapon. Plans that existed, plans that took place before the Iran nuclear deal took place. This in itself proves that the Iran nuclear deal was a success. Iran shelved any and all plans and ambitions to build a nuclear weapon in response to the deal. Prime Minister Netanyahu's calls to action against Iran should be received as a calls to praise for how effective diplomacy truly is. And as for the US getting nothing in return, preventing the rise of a nuclear armed conflict in the region with heightened possibilities of war is, as everyone in this room should agree, certainly far from nothing. And how is that possibly worse than what the alternative may have been? Would it have been better to have skipped diplomacy and engaged directly in warfare? A conflict that would have endangered the lives of American and allied troops and further jeopardizing stability within the region? First strike should never be first choice. So the pursuit of peace is often labeled idealistic, and opponents of building a peaceful global community see diplomacy as dangerous and naive. Now, first, World War I was already the war to end all wars, and it failed because of bureaucrats getting in the way of proper diplomacy. A Second World War and spiraling hotspots 73 years later, we see that there are many prices that we're still having to pay for the shortcomings of those before us. But what has changed is our understanding of diplomacy. The Marshall Plan, the Cuban Missile Crisis, ping-pong diplomacy leading to Nixon in China, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Iran nuclear deal, NATO, the EU, and the United Nations. Diplomacy is the be-all to end-all in ensuring a prosperous world future. Now, knowing all of this, we can disregard the cries from chicken hawks and understand that first strike should never be first choice, and that diplomacy is the only path for us to achieving a secured world future. Thank you.
So if you guys want to write down on your little paper there which team you thought did a better job presenting the argument, and then we will come and collect them. After such time, we're going to be entertaining questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, I will call on you in a few minutes.